My name is Jakob Endrestad Kielland. I'm a developer and a consultant at Variant here in Trondheim. And today I have two goals. The first one is to teach you something that you might use because it's useful either at work or in a hobby project. And the second one, which is much more important to me, is to make you a little bit excited about the future of CSS and even how far we've already gotten today. So the structure of this talk is something I've heard described as a shotgun buffet before, because I'm going to shoot a bunch of cool things at you and you can pick the ones that you like. And you don't need to take any notes. There's going to be a cheat sheet at the end of the presentation with everything that I've gone through. So we're going to start talking a little bit about browser support. And then after that, we're going to look at features which you can use today in practice because they either have fairly good support in browsers or because they have a polyfill. And then we're going to look a little bit into the future. And that's just a different word for features that don't have good support. But it's still really cool, so we're going to show them off anyway. But yeah, let's start with the boring part, browsers. Because every web developer knows that the enemy of any modern functionality are users who refuse to update their browsers. And we have a couple of tools that can help us with this. The first one is a website that I'm sure most of you have already used. It's caniuse.com, which lets you search for a feature, and it'll tell you what percentage of the global user base supports that feature. So we can see that Flexbox is supported by 98% of global users, for example. Next, we have PostCSS. PostCSS is a really useful tool. It's a CSS preprocessor, which means that it runs transformations on your code after you've written it before you actually ship it anywhere. And depending on what plugins you give it, it can do a bunch of really useful things. Or in other words, this bad boy can fit so much functionality. And the functionality that we care about is right there in the front seat, polyfills. So for those of you who don't know, a polyfill will take your sleek modern code and turn it into something that's really ugly and smelly that has the added benefit of actually running on older browsers. And specifically, there's one plugin, which is actually kind of a pack of plugins, which is your absolute best friend when using modern CSS, and it's this one, PostCSS Preset ENV. So what this will let you do is decide on a set of features that you want to support, as well as define a list of browser versions that you want to support, and then it'll do all the necessary polyfills to make that happen. So now we're at the fun part. So for each feature, I've included the caniuse.com support percentage, as well as a checkmark if there's a polyfill available. And so we're going to start with a few pseudo-class functions that help us write better selectors. These ones are fairly mainstream. They've been around for a few years, but we're going to start here and then get more futuristic from here. So first, we're going to talk about is and where. And let's say that I want to apply styling to, for example, a div and a span. Then I can do it like this. This is the sensible way to do it. Or I could use an isSelector, because the isSelector resolves if one of the selectors inside of it are resolved. And so in this case, this is not particularly useful, but it really shines when you start combining it with larger selectors. So if we have something like this, for example, which is obviously terrible, where I want to style any heading that's directly inside either an article or a section, it's much, much nicer if you write it with the isSelector. And so here, the isSelector, that function itself, will have the specificity of the selector inside with the highest specificity. And if that's a problem for you, you can use the where selector. So in this case, I have a piece of CSS that's going to break prod if we overwrite it. So in this case, I want to use the where selector instead, because the where selector does exactly the same as the isSelector, except that it doesn't have any specificity. Next, we have the hasSelector. And so this has also been around for a little while now, but you can do some really cool stuff with it that I'm going to show you now. But first of all, the hasSelector effectively lets you check whether an element contains something else. So let's say that I want to style my container here. If and only if it has an h1 inside of it, we can do that with the hasSelector. But we can also get a little bit more fancy, because let's say that we want to conditionally style something based on whether it has 3 or more elements inside of it. We can do that with the hasSelector looking for the third child, and this is really useful. And I've made even like a slightly more fancy demo here as well. This is a very minimal form. It has an email input as well as a hint that will tell the user to please input a valid email. And as you can see, that hint is hidden by default. But if our form has an invalid email, which is also not in focus, then it's going to display that hint. And we can see what this looks like in practice. And to me, this really looks like something that you'd need JavaScript for, but this is just HTML and CSS. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about cascade layers. So very often, multiple pieces of CSS are competing to style the same element, right? And so in this case, both the ID selector and the element selector want to style that H1. And as I'm sure most of you know, the ID selector has a stronger specificity, and therefore, we get a medium aquamarine text. But this is just one part of the cascade, which is the C in CSS, actually. And the cascade is what lets the browser decide which styling should be applied to which element. And there are a bunch more levels here, but these are the most common ones. So those are the ones I've included. And cascade layers fits in there right between inline styles and selector specificity. And so what a cascade layer will let you do is categorize your styling in multiple layers of different importance. And so the later you define a layer, the more important it's going to be. And so everything inside the specific layer, in this case, is going to be more important than everything inside the base layer. So even though the ID selector would usually be stronger here, our text is saddle brown. And so a pattern that you'll very often see with cascade layers is that you'll use the first line of the file to define the order that you want the layers to be in terms of importance, because it's only the first order of appearance, like the time that they appear the first time, that matters for how important they are. So if you do it like this, which is, again, pretty common, you can refer back to them in any order that you like afterwards. Next, we have a quick and easy one, which is like really useful once you know it actually exists. Aspect ratio does exactly what you think it does. If you give something an aspect ratio of 1, it's going to try to be a square. You can give it something else if you want, 16:9, for example. And this is like just one of those things. When you know it exists, it's great because it makes a lot of tasks a lot easier. Next, we have accent color. And so we're going to do some audience participation now. Please raise your hand if you've made a custom checkbox before. Yeah, so all of you will know that it takes an absolutely stupid amount of CSS to do this. Like specifically, it takes this much CSS. And this is a basic example, by the way. This is from a tutorial. And I mean, it's 2024. Surely we can do better than this, right? What if I told you that you could do all of that with one line of CSS now? If I told you that, I'd be a liar, because you can't. But if you just want to change the color of your checkbox, you can do it with accent color. And so if you're tired of this like standard safe blue and you'd like an olive drab checkbox instead, that's just one line now. This also works with radio buttons, range sliders, and progress bars. Next, we have a feature that I wasn't sure if I was going to include because some of you may see that it's at a whopping 0% browser support. And that's not like 0.2, that's actually 0. No browsers support this. And that's because this is just a draft specification. But there is a polyfill if you want to use it, so I've decided to include it because it's pretty cool. And so this is kind of a similar example to what we saw earlier with the is selector. So here I want to style any paragraph directly following any heading. And this is obviously not very nice. A much better way would be to use the is selector, like I said. But what if we want to use this a bunch of other places as well? Then we'd have to write this over and over. Or what if it's like a really difficult and long selector that we'd like to give a descriptive name? That's where custom selectors come in. So here we can define a custom selector by using @custom_selector and giving it a name and saying what that selector should be equivalent to. And so all of these 3 examples here are equivalent. And so if you want to reuse this multiple places, you can do it like this. Or if you have some sort of like unreadable monstrosity that you'd like to give a descriptive name, you can let everyone know easily that this is actually a really bad idea. Next, we have container queries. So a very common problem for us is that our layouts will vary by available space, right? And you're going to tell me that, Jakob, we have a solution for this. They're called media queries. And that's true, but only if your layout depends on this, the space available in the entire viewport. And that's not always the case, right? And so let's say that we have an application like this. Here, we have a list with results that we want the list to change layout once there's not enough space. And this is with a media query, so changing the viewport works. But if I change the resizable sidebar, we can see that the viewport doesn't help us, or the media query doesn't help us at all, right? Because the viewport is still the same. And that's where container queries come in. So we can define this list of results as a container, give it a name, which I've called it cat list, and say that we want to watch the size of this container. And then all we need to do is switch our media query with a container query, which is almost identical, except you also have to include the name of the container that you're interested in watching. And now we're suddenly, instead of watching the viewport size, we're watching the container size. And so we can see that when we change the viewport, the layout is going to change, but also when we change the resizable sidebar, the layout is going to change. And honestly, this is how it's been working like in my head, in my mental model anyway, and media queries have kind of just needed to like fit into that mental model. So it's really cool that we can just do this now, because when are we like actually interested in the viewport? We're interested in the size of the container, right? And so now we're at the part where we're going to look a little bit into the future. In other words, this is stuff that you probably shouldn't use in production yet, although most of these are things that you can add kind of as like progressive enhancement. So the nice thing about CSS is that your application doesn't break if a browser doesn't support the CSS you're using, right? So a lot of this you can add as like spice on top without having to worry about it breaking for users who don't have updated browsers. And so we're going to start with anchor positioning. And so this actually has a polyfill. It's a JavaScript polyfill, but I've put it in this section because the polyfill only supports the most basic features, so it doesn't support everything that I'm going to show you now. I'm going to start with some wisdom here, which is don't make custom input elements. That's for the simple reason that custom input elements sucks, or making them sucks. And there are a lot of good reasons for that. The best way to start appreciating native input elements is by trying to make custom ones. But one of the problems that you might have is that it's kind of a pain to position sort of popover elements next to other elements, and you can have some problems with this. And so let's say that, for example, the drop-down menu of a select element or the UI of a date picker, this needs to pop over the UI, like your application, right? And you often want it to be attached to a certain spot in your HTML. And that's where anchor position can really help us. And so here I'm making a custom select element. And so I have the what I've called the select element, which is the box at the top, which is always visible, as well as the drop-down, which is visible only when it's open. And so to use anchor positioning, I'm going to start by tethering these two elements. And so this can be done in HTML, but this is a CSS doc, so we're going to do it in CSS. And it's pretty simple. You start by giving the anchor a name. So here I've called it select. And then in our drop-down element, we have to give it either position absolute or position fixed. Both will work. And say that the position anchor for this element is the anchor that I created earlier. And that looks like this. Yeah, this hasn't actually done anything yet. We've connected these with anchor positioning, but we haven't actually positioned it, which is another step. And so what we need to do now is we need to make that positioning. And so there are multiple ways to do this. In my opinion, this is the simplest, just by using the position area property. And so on our drop-down menu, we're saying that we want this to be positioned at the bottom of our anchor. And then it works. And so one of the problems, because let's be real, this is pretty easy to do with a wrapper and some relative positioning. But one of the nice things about anchor positioning is that it can help with problems like this. Because let's say that this element is right at the bottom of the page, or maybe it's inside another container and you can't see the entire list. And so native elements, they solve this for us by just putting the list on top of even the window. But when we're using a custom element like this, there's no help. And that's where we can use the position try fallbacks property, which is really cool. So what we're basically saying here is that you should put this at the bottom, but if putting it at the bottom would make it go outside of the viewport, then you should try putting it at the top instead. So that's a fallback. And so we can see that when we open it now, it's automatically going to go up to the top, and when there's space on the bottom, it's going to go down to the bottom again. Next, we have interpolate size. By the way, this was at 0% support just a few weeks ago, so we're racing along here. And so something that I've done quite often, and I'm sure that you've done as well, is trying to animate the opening and closing of an element like this, which is surprisingly difficult. Because how we would like to do that is by setting a height of 0 by default, and then setting the height to be auto when it's open, and then transitioning on the height property, right? But previously, the browser hasn't let us transition between two numbers unless they're actually discrete, like specific numbers. Like auto has not worked. And that's changed now. We need to enable it. They were considering actually implementing this as the default behavior, but of course it would break a bunch of sites that absolutely require transitions to auto to not work to be usable. But it's pretty simple to activate it. All you need to do is set this property, interpolate size, to allow keywords. And then you can set it on your root because this inherits down in your entire page. So you can just set it like this. And that is going to make it possible to transition to and from auto and min content and max content and these sort of like inherent values. Finally, we're at what is probably my favorite feature of this bunch, which is cross-document view transitions. And so this is really just the tip of an iceberg. That iceberg is called the View Transitions API. And there's so much cool stuff to show off there that you kind of need to do a whole separate talk. I would know. But we're looking at specifically cross-document view transitions now. And so what this API will let you do is control how the browser transitions from one view to another. And cross-document means that these are navigations between separate HTML pages. So just a normal navigation when you click a link in the web. And to enable this API, you need to include this snippet of CSS on both the origin page and the destination page. And as long as they're both on the same domain, the API is going to be enabled. And by default, that's going to cause the navigation to happen with a fade animation instead of just like a hard snap. And so we can see what that looks like here. And so this is just a normal web page, like no frameworks or anything. And you can see that there's like a little fade animation between them. And there's a lot of stuff that you can do. As I said, that this API is full of cool features. But specifically, what I'm going to show you now is that you can give names to like specific elements on both the origin and destination page. Because if the browser sees that you've given a view transition name to that's the same both in the origin page and the destination, then it's going to assume that that element should be transitioned smoothly from the origin page to the destination page. So if that element has changed position or changed size, the browser is going to automatically animate that. And so I've added view transition names to some of the boxes and the image and the button and stuff here, and you're going to see what that looks like now. And so this is like a grand total of 7 lines of CSS just working in Chrome. Now, I think this is really cool because this is super powerful. It's also obviously easy to abuse to create a terrible UX. But if we're responsible, I think we can create a lot of really cool things with this. So that's everything that I had time to show you. This is the cheat sheet that I promised. You can also find my slides there if you're interested. Thank you very much.